I thought buying a private lake would finally give me the silence I've been chasing my whole life, but instead, it kicked off a psychological war that I never saw coming. And honestly, looking back at the wreckage of that situation, I realized that some people don an oppos. Just want order. They want to own your soul. You see, I spent 15 years living in a cramped, gray apartment in the city where my neighbor's alarm clock was basically my alarm clock. So when I saw a listing for 20 acres of rugged land with a neglected, murky lake called Blackwood Basin, I didn't an oppos. See a mess. I saw a sanctuary. Everyone told me I was losing my mind because the shoreline was collapsing into the water and the previous owner had basically used the shallows as a personal junkyard. But I'd done my homework. And I mean really dug into the dusty county records and zoning maps until my eyes bled, confirming that this specific patch of water was a legal anomaly. A private slice of heaven sitting right on the edge of a high-end development called the Gables, yet completely, legally, and gloriously outside there. HOA's Iron Fist. The first few weeks were pure, grueling bliss. Just me and a pair of heavy-duty waiters pulling rusted bed frames and old tires out of the muck while the sun beat down on my neck. And I remember feeling this incredible sense of ownership. Not the kind you get from a piece of paper, but the kind you earn through sweat and blisters. I started planting native switchgrass and willow saplings to stabilize the mud, watching the water slowly clear from a sickly pea soup green to something that actually reflected the sky. And for a moment, I thought I'd escaped the world's nonsense, but then came the footsteps. I was hammering the first cedar post for a simple perimeter fence. Nothing aggressive, just some rustic wood and thin wire to keep the local stray dogs and curious hikers from falling into the restoration zones. When I felt that prickle on the back of my neck that tells you you're being watched, I turned around to see a woman standing on the ridge that marked the property line, and she looked like she'd been carbon copied out of a luxury real estate magazine, with every strand of hair sprayed into submission and a pantsuit that probably cost more than my truck. She didn't an oppos, offer a quote, welcome to the neighborhood quote, or even a nod. She just marched down the slope with this terrifying, rehearsed confidence and asked me, with a voice like shattering glass, who exactly had given me permission to quote, disfigure the communal vista, quote. I just stood there, wiping mud off my forehead, and calmly explained that since I was the one paying the taxes on this mud, I was the one giving the permission, but she didn't an oppos. To even blink, she just kept talking. Over me about quote, aesthetic harmony quote, and how the Gables had a quote, long-standing tradition of shared lake access quote. I tried to be the bigger person, I really did. So I reached into my truck and pulled out the laminated plot map and the county and oppos. S-sign verification showed her the bold red line where the HOA's jurisdiction ended and my life began. She barely looked at it. Instead, she just peered over her designer sunglasses and told me that quote, tradition trumps paper quote, and that if I didn't oppos, stop the construction of what she called my quote, barbed wire eyesore quote. By sunset, I'd be hearing from their legal committee. It was such a surreal moment, standing there in the dirt while this woman, let's call her Beatrice, tried to gaslight me into believing my own backyard belonged to her bridge club. And when I told her that quote, being used as something doesn't an oppos, mean you own it, quote, the mask of politeness didn't an oppos. Just slipped, it disintegrated, and she hissed something about how people like me always think they're special until the fines start piling up. Over the next few days, the psychological warfare shifted from face-to-face threats to a literal mountain of mail, and every time I walked to my mailbox, I felt this knot of anxiety in my stomach because it was filled with quote, notice of non-compliance quote, letters quote, urgent violation quote, warnings printed on heavy, expensive stationery. They weren't oppos. Just attacking the fence anymore. They were claiming my restoration work was quote, unauthorized environmental tampering quote, and that my presence was quote, disturbing the peaceful enjoyment of the community quote, which was hilarious considering the lake had been a stagnant mosquito breeding ground before I arrived. I'd be out there at 6 a.m., knee-deep in water planting lilies, and I'd see groups of residents standing on the ridge with binoculars, pointing and whispering like I was some kind of invasive species they were trying to figure out how to eradicate. It started getting darker, though, because someone I wanted oppos, say who, but she had very distinct blonde highlights, decided to start calling the county sheriff on me, claiming there was, in quote, illegal dumping, in quote, and in quote, unlicensed construction, in quote, happening on the site. The deputies would roll up, look at my permits, look at the beautiful, healing shoreline, and then look at the furious crowd of HOA members hovering at the property line, and they'd just sigh and tell me to keep doing what I was doing, but the constant surveillance was starting to wear me thin. I realized then that Beatrice and her board Warren and Oppos, T actually worried about the fence or the, in quote, vista, in quote. They were terrified of the precedent I was setting, because if one person could live right under their noses without bowing to their architectural committee, the whole illusion of their absolute power would start to crumble. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when I found a, in quote, final cease and desist, in quote, taped to my cedar post, claiming that the HOA had, in quote, voted to annex the lake area for the public good, in quote, and that I had 48 hours to clear my equipment or they would, in quote, reclaim, in quote, the land by force. I didn't oppose. T get angry this time. I got quiet, and that's when you should probably start worrying about me, because I spent the next 24 hours in a dark room with a pot of coffee, my attorney on speakerphone, and every single historical deed to that land dating back to the 1940s. We found the, in quote, smoking gun, in quote, a document from the original developer of the Gables who had tried to buy the lake back in the 80s, but was flatly refused by the previous owner, leading to a legal carve-out that specifically forbade the HOA from ever claiming any right, title, or interest in Blackwood Basin. I didn't oppose. T sent a letter back. I waited until their monthly, in quote, community harmony, in quote, meeting, which was being held in a tent right near my property line, and I walked right up to the podium while Beatrice was mid-sentence about, in quote, preserving our shared heritage, in quote. The room went dead silent, and I didn't oppose. TL, I didn't oppose. T make a scene. I just laid out the original 1982 exclusion deed, the modern survey, and a very specific letter from the state attorney's office regarding, and, quote, harassment and attempted land theft, end quote. I looked Beatrice right in the eyes and told the entire room that if one more letter showed up in my mailbox, or if one more person stepped a toe onto my grass without an invitation, I wouldn't just be suing the HOA. I'd be suing every board member individually for malicious prosecution and civil rights violations. You could have heard a pin drop on the grass, and the look on Beatrice's face wasn't oppose. T just anger anymore. It was the look of a person who had realized the walls of her little kingdom were made of cardboard, and she had finally run into someone who knew exactly how to light a match. A week later, a tiny 3-sentence update appeared on the back page of their neighborhood newsletter, buried under the lost pet section, stating that, in quote, boundary clarifications for the basin area are complete, in quote, and that, in quote, residents are reminded to respect private property limits, end quote, which was the closest thing to a white flag I was ever going to get. Now, when I sit on my porch and watch the herons return to the water, which is clear enough to see the fish darting through the reeds, the silence is finally real, and the fence is still there, not as a wall of hate, but as a reminder that your peace is worth protecting, even if you have to go to war to keep it. But it makes me wonder, because I still see them sometimes standing on that ridge, looking down on my clean water with this mix of longing and resentment. And it makes me think about how many people out there are currently paying fines or following ridiculous rules just because they're afraid to look at the paperwork. Did I overstep by being so aggressive with illegal threats? Or is that the only language people like Beatrice actually understand? I mean, should a, in quote, community in oppose, as tradition, in quote, ever hold more weight than a person in oppose, as legal right to their own land, or are we all just one bad neighbor away from a total breakdown of the peace? Let me know what you think in the comments, because I'm curious if you would have fought for that mud, or if you would have just torn down the fence too. Keep the peace, because from where I'm sitting, the water has never looked better.